Good morning. This is the light entertainment part about the future, because luckily nobody can prove whether I'm right or wrong yet. So we see how we go. So this is from, I guess, from Lendscape to landscape. I'm basically thinking about the context over the next 10 years or so. When I've asked a few people already, what question would you like to ask about the future? What tended to come back was, what's this industry going to look like in 10 years? So my immediate response to that is, well, what's the context of the industry? How could the landscape around it change over that period of time? You already heard a little bit about my background, but I've been doing this rather strange activity of helping people think about the future for quite a number of years now, and done this in the United States. I started in the US, then moved to Australia, and then back here in the early 2000s, working with government departments, working with many different commercial companies. One of the more recent things I did in 2012 was help the Ministry of Defense think about cyber power, which was just coming onto their radar screen at that time. So the whole question of cyber risk and so on. So my approach is not limited to a particular industry. I'm certainly not a banker, I'm not a financier. It's a way of looking at an industry, and it can be applied to more or less anything, I like to think. So it is, however, you might say, a somewhat low-tech industry. It reminds me a little of the way that they used balloons to observe the battlefield during the First World War. And in the sense that you're looking into a territory that you can't access directly, you're looking from a distance, and you're trying to interpret what's going on. However, notice that of the two guys in the balloon, one of them's got a map. Now, this map presumably dated from before the hostilities began, and the whole point is to look at the map and see if something's changing on the ground. So this notion of having a map is really important. And very often, people in an industry, for example, I think in the central banks I'm going to talk about, have a map of the way they think, for example, the economy works, but the map may be wrong or out of date. So part of the job is to see whether the map needs to be revised. This is slightly different from making forecasts. It's trying to see whether, well, the way in which we think about things are changing. If our interpretation of how that works is wrong, then we're inevitably going to get the wrong idea about where things are going. So in the case of banking, finance, this used to be a world of very familiar animals, stable over long periods of time for the most part, and it's only recently that things have begun to change really rapidly. Now, this reminds me of this idea of a Cambrian explosion, which often gets referred to. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but about 500 million years ago in the fossil record, there was a sudden burst of new species. I don't think it's properly understood why that happened. It doesn't seem to be fully accounted for by evolutionary theory. But anyway, suddenly all these new species, completely bizarre animals, some of those, not all of them survived, but there was a kind of consolidation over time, and all of these different body plans for organisms suddenly burst on the scene, and then there's a selection that goes on. So typically this is what happens in the business arena. There's a burst of new entrance into an emerging market space, in this case I think really created by the internet, and the possibility of maybe doing finance differently on the internet. So there's immediately a burst of companies trying to find ways of doing this, and typically what happens after a while is, obviously they don't all survive. The ones that have found the best answers survive. Now there are some, of course, circling around this. There are some big predators. What it was, Amazon, Google, Apple. Are they going to enter this space? In which case, what happens to the early entrants? The only thing I would say about that is that people have been talking about that and speculating about that for quite some time now, and those large players haven't quite made a move, and where they have, Apple's credit card, it's in partnership. But we shall see. But of course, there are more powerful technologies following along, and particularly artificial intelligence. So I don't know if you noticed that this robot, Sophia, I guess some people have seen some of the videos of Sophia talking, being hosted at conferences. Is this something everybody's seen? No, maybe not. Not much reaction from the audience here. Anyway, Sophia is a walking, talking, smiling robot that is the sort of front end of a big AI system. So it's kind of interesting that the Saudi Arabians have given this robot citizenship. So you just wonder what follows from that. You know, does the robot now, being a citizen, being a person, we have corporations are regarded as legal persons, but what about robots? What about whole AI systems? You know, is she now able to have a bank account, for example? Can she, sitting in Saudi Arabia, do financial transactions? You know, I mean, you begin to wonder what could flow from this. But certainly, the use of AI in the background is I think going to become more and more important. There is the dark side of all this, you know, and I guess you've read about the China's social credit score, and you can see this rather ominous description that they give. You know, the Chinese government gave instructions to the various companies that were going to compete to produce this system, that the trustworthy could roam everywhere under heaven, but the discredited would find it hard to take a single step. Now, you know, I suspect this will not be limited to China. We already have the beginnings of this kind of thing, although the controversies with Facebook and so on, I think, are signaling that is probably going to come here. But this gets meshed with credit scores, and you see the beginnings of the way a sort of totalization of financial data, together with artificial intelligence, the sort of direction in which it might be moving. Then, of course, the other big innovation is cryptocurrency. It's interesting for those who are into conspiracy theories that the whole thing, the Bitcoin white paper, of course, we know about from 2008, but back in 1997, there was a research paper by the National Security Agency in the US, more or less describing what Bitcoin would be. Now, some people think there might be a direct line between these two. That's not entirely clear, but it raises questions as to, since we don't know who the notorious say the word, Satoshi Sakamoto actually is, you know, sorry, Satoshi Nakamoto, you know, get it the right way around, who he actually is, and whether this is a front for more nefarious things, we don't know. But certainly Bitcoin is continuing to gain traction. I see just in the last few months that it's been used for settling export deals, and there's talk at an IMF conference of creating Bitcoin-backed bonds. So it doesn't look like it's going away, and as we see the prices beginning to creep up again. So I think this is a major element and raises really the whole question at the center of all of this, which is the way that money is created. And I think the distinction between credit and money is becoming increasingly blurred. And for me, the analogy is a bit like, this is rather like nuclear power. Nuclear power is extremely useful, but also potentially dangerous. And so society likes to contain this kind of thing. You know, you need the energy produced. Banking and finance is absolutely essential to the economy. There's no way of doing without it. But at the same time, it has this tendency to, you know, get out of control, we might say. And efforts to control finance, of course, go back hundreds and thousands of years. And we see here the sort of thing that gets people going. This is a Venetian, 16th century Venetian senator grumbling about the way bankers could just pay themselves by writing a couple of lines with their quill pens, presumably, to issue themselves finance. But you see the same kind of sort of anxiety around finance and banking today. And so what we've seen, of course, is sort of cycles of regulation and deregulation. So there was a lot of regulation coming out of the financial problems of the 1930s, and those held for really quite a long time. What's sort of disappointing, if you happen to be in the industry, of course, this graphic demonstrates that the financial wage relative to the rest of the wages in the economy tends to go up and down with that degree of regulation. If you have a boring regulated industry like through the Bretton Woods period, the wages paid to bankers are not all that high relatively, but once you get to the 90s and the Clinton government conveniently removes a lot of this, you suddenly have a tremendous burst of activity and the wages rise. Now the question is this in fact a kind of cyclical phenomenon? Are we running into problems arising from that, and that over the next equivalent period of time we'll see the whole industry re-regulated? This would imply perhaps that there might be another crisis that we're in. So this is kind of open question, but if you're looking at the future, you're looking for ways of structuring your ideas about what might happen. So patterns that have occurred in the past, it's very plausible that they could repeat into the future. This is more of a projection than it's not a forecast in that sense. Now, we think regulation is absolutely necessary. I mean, you can't have a banking system without regulation, can you? Well, actually, in historical record tells us that you can. And the examples of Scotland and Canada during quite an extended period coming out of the late 18th century into the 19th century are that both of those countries managed to have what is called a free banking system. They had no central bank. They also had no crises. There was a gold standard underlying the issuance of money. Anybody could start a bank and compete with all the other banks, and you succeeded or failed based on how well you performed. And it also produced a kind of lockstep effect. So the banks were all looking at it, they were all taking each other's paper and observing how risky the behavior of the other banks was. And so it was essentially a self-regulating system. And another possibly not insignificant feature of this was that in Scotland, for example, by an act of Parliament in London, Scottish banks were not permitted to lend money to government. Possibly that saved them a lot of trouble. But you see, at one point, there was concern about what was going on in Scotland, and there was a parliamentary committee to look at it in 1826, and they came back saying this amazing thing about, it's a system admirably calculated to economize the use of capital and excite and cherish a spirit of useful enterprise, going further to promote the moral habits of the people by the direct inducements to the maintenance of character for industry, integrity and prudence. I mean, it'd be hard to find an official report describing banking in those sort of terms today, which is interesting. But it is possible. See, this is existence proof that actually the whole industry could be seen in an extremely different light. Does this suggest that all we need to do is take away the central banks? Well, I'm not necessarily saying that, but there's an interesting hint here. If we actually look at what the central banks are doing, things are not going so well. This is an article from the Financial Times a couple of years back. Because this is where we get to the maps, the second guy in the balloon holding the map. The central bankers have a map of the way the economy, or models of the way the economy is supposed to work. And particularly, these are based on the idea of the Phillips curve, that there's a connection between employment and inflation. But in more recent years, that's not working. And yet the models, these assumptions are so well embedded in the models and in economic theory that this is still being held on to, and it's perhaps not surprising that they're finding it very hard to produce inflation again in the economy. So this does rather suggest that there might be a different approach. Interestingly, if you go back to where this kind of modeling comes from, Phillips himself built these hydraulic models, possibly, although I'm not sure, it'd be an interesting question as to whether he derived his insight into the Phillips curve from attempting to make these hydraulic models of the economy, which were the forerunners of the later computer models. And there's one of these still surviving in the Science Museum. There were tanks of water and plastic tubes and plotter pens to track the movement of the water through the system, followed the movement of money in the economy. But of course, this does assume that you've got a fixed set of relationships. This is the assumption behind this, and that the relationships themselves don't start changing. And I think that's probably where the models are not working. Now, there are other ways of modeling the economy. There's the whole treatment of the economy as a complex adaptive system using agent-based models and so on. There are other ways of doing this which might well produce better answers. But a particular assumption in mainstream economics is that you've got these rational responses by rational players in the economy to price signals given out by central bankers. So essentially, you've got this bell curve of data, and it will always revert to the mean. Whereas the complex adaptive system would have a power curve of price data, and you can get some very extreme behaviors occurring under that, and you can get these sudden tipping point kinds of events, which you would never expect to see under the assumptions that are prevailing currently in central banking. So, of course, there's a debate going on about whether central banks should change their approach, but it's rather like trying to turn a supertanker. There's an awful lot of people who have to agree at all sorts of levels, from the economic theory upwards, that such a change is needed. But of course, what we do experience is these sort of tipping point events, which are not very welcome. And the speed, of course, at which they propagate through the economy is a function of that connectedness. So if the complex adaptive system risk is to do with connectivity and the speed of connection, the fact that everything's now unified digitally doesn't make things any better. So, there's a problem of some kind. And it's not helped by the technology. The technology is very useful, but if you don't really have a good map or model of the way the whole thing's working, then you're really setting up a potential major problem. Now, what the problem actually is, I guess you can write on the back of a napkin. Because there is a lack of real growth in the economy, there's a deflationary tendency. So the banks and central banks and governments really don't want that, because government debt would start increasing if you had a deflationary situation. Inflation again, and I'm old enough to remember the inflation of the 1970s. So the idea that the central banks are actually trying to create it seems a bit bizarre, because it was a huge problem back then. But and then governments are then scrambling for more tax revenue because they need to meet the debts that have been created. The debt overhang, which was then converted from private debt to public debt in the financial crisis, is still sitting there. And of course, everybody's asking, well, all this quantitative easing, where's the inflation? But of course, what we do have is asset inflation rather than price inflation. So it's happening and may well hit price inflation too. But just for the moment, we have that situation. And you can tell the story of what's happened since the global financial crisis, but it's not obvious that there's a way out of this. Is this leading to a loss of confidence in the system on a wide scale? The problems are fairly clear, but what to do about it is not, and also seeing what might happen. Now, going back to earlier points, the 1930s, late 1920s and 1930s, where maybe there was a rather similar situation to today. And who saw it coming? Well, here is the great economist Keynes talking to the so-called Raven of Zurich, Felix Sommery, who was extremely good. I guess he must have been a slightly pessimistic character, because he was very good at calling crises in advance. So here, this marvelous conversation reported in Sommery's autobiography of his conversation with Keynes, in which Keynes is saying, I don't think there will be another crisis in our lifetime. Where would that come from? And we all think Keynes is one of the master economists of all time. And Sommery gives a very sort of George Soros-like answer. Well, it's going to come from the discrepancy between perception and reality. So are we sitting in that kind of place? And who is our Felix Sommery for today? Who has a handle on when that next crisis might come? Well, one thing that comes to my mind in thinking about the nature of this problem we're facing is that, in a sense, banking, the whole financial system, is like a hyperobject. Now, this notion of hyperobjects was launched in a book a few years ago by an American academic, and he was arguing that there are some huge problems society has created, and his primary one was global warming, hence the iceberg on the book cover, which are symptoms which everybody acknowledges, but nobody really can get their arms around. Here's another one, slightly more obscure. This is a satellite photograph of the BP Deep Horizon oil spill. So the width of the satellite photograph is about 500 miles. So the oil spill is a phenomenon about 200 to 300 miles wide. So that's just the visual aspect. Of course, the other thing about many of these problems are essentially invisible. It's very, if we could see them all easily, they would be a whole lot easier to deal with. But there are levels of complexity in society and business which underlie these kinds of things. And when they happen, they tend to take people off guard. So I like to think of this whole thing, we have the financial system is like a hyperobject. We can't easily visualize it, but it's sitting there in the timeline like a sort of gigantic iceberg or something. Largely, I think, in its current manifestation, caused by the banking deregulation by the Clinton administration in the 90s, because that's when it really started spinning out of control. The addition of computerization for creating derivatives didn't help. I think around 2004 or so that really became available. So dicing up these securities and recombining them, which was be quite hard work before. But of course, as the Lehman Brothers problem showed us. It's one thing to create these things, but then to unpick afterwards to try and see who owes who what in any kind of decent time frame is extremely difficult. So somehow or other, I think this sort of hyperobject thing will have to be resolved in some way. But what exactly, who can do that and how it might be done is a very difficult question. So we ask, well, who actually owns this problem? Well, another way of thinking of the hyperobject is as a Swiss mountain, of course. I mean, I think that's sort of official view. Finance is rock solid at the bottom. And you have these Olympian bodies at the top, the G20 and the IMF and so on, who like to think that they can deal with problems like this and cascading down their wisdom to the lower levels. So what is it, trying to read the tea leaves, what is it that the IMF have in store if there is another crisis? What are their moves to try and anticipate this? How am I doing for time? Okay. So they're making a number of interesting moves going on quietly in the background, and one concerns the special drawing right, the IMF SDR, which is they're gradually building out an infrastructure for SDR markets, and on the basis that there's a paper SDR. At the same time, the economy is being pushed towards being as cashless as possible. Now, interestingly, that allows negative interest rates to really bite. And it must be very frustrating to economists, any economists in the audience, to have a theory that if you have negative interest rates, as Mario Draghi has been attempting, that everybody will respond, but not if they've got cash. Not if their money isn't directly accessible. But if you make everything cashless, then of course you can make the economic theory work. So that old joke about economists, the people who lie in bed awake at night worrying whether what works in theory can possibly work in practice. Well, here's the answer: go cashless. And then there's a push through the OECD to make basically that space, the money flow space among the G20 countries completely transparent, so that really enables taxation to occur much more easily. So there's this BEPS thing, which is base erosion and profit shifting, so that nobody quite understands what it is that's being talked about. So that's underway. And then meanwhile, a repositioning of gold internationally. So the gold one's kind of interesting in that if you're going to move to possibly have to move to an SDR, gold-backed SDR, then you'd want a sort of more or less a parity in terms of gold reserves in terms of the size of the country economies. Now China, I've got there at the end, official reserves of China are the lowest of that group, but unofficial estimates suggest that China may have around 4,000 tons of gold, putting them rather higher in the ranking. Italy, of course, there's a struggle going on at the moment between the Five-Star Party and the European Central Bank as to whether they might get control of Italy's gold reserves, because that's obviously a rather juicy thing to have a go at. But the underlying story here is somebody getting ready, or is somebody thinking that maybe a gold standard might be needed again, in which case repositioning the gold would be a good move. Now, what's the idea if there's a crisis? Well, the obvious one is we hit another liquidity crisis. Bailouts were very expensive last time, so how about bail-ins this time? Freeze the whole thing, freeze all the transactions on an emergency basis, and then gradually release things again. So that's basically what happened in Cyprus and to an extent in Greece. So we say, well, that's just Cyprus. Well, maybe this is if you have a really emergency situation, maybe this is what people are thinking, what those Olympian gods at the top of the Swiss Alp are thinking. In this case, you'd be introducing the special drawing right on an emergency basis and possibly having to back it with gold. That would be an open question. But of course, if what's going on, you're doing this because the US government is no longer in a position to mount the kind of rescue that it did before, so you're beginning to shift to the special drawing right as basically the global reserve currency taking over from the dollar. What's that going to do to the dollar? That's where the inflation is going to kick in, because gold will be hugely revalued if you're going to use it in that way. There's only a relatively small amount of gold, and the way to make it go round is to increase the value dramatically. So if you increase gold's value, what's going to happen to the dollar, the US dollar, and other fiat currencies? It will inflate like mad, and everybody's savings are going to be wiped out. This is where you get the structural adjustments that economists like to talk about. But the big question is there going to be an orderly outcome from all that? This will be a major shock across society. People were insulated to some degree last time around, but what's going to happen possibly next time? Now, will there be a next time? I have a nasty feeling there is going to be a similar shock. Question, of course, is when. So now, get out the crystal ball. But if there were a repeat, if there's some kind of cycle going on here, there's an argument that there's a 9-year and an 18-year cycle, and that the 18-year cycle represents real estate crash, and the 9 years sort of intermediate one. So that would possibly suggest, look at the way the curve there is beginning to go down, that there might be another event in 2020, 2021. And then what happens? If we're lucky and it's relatively shallow, then maybe there's a big one later in the 20s. But it's, it would not surprise me to see this kind of pattern playing out. So beware. But where does this put us? I mean, basically, the dollar goes away, and we're left with one of these contenders to become the reserve currency. I have opinions as to which one it might end up being, or some combination of them. But certainly things are changing. So I have to stop now, do I? Okay, all right. I shall stop. Questions? Okay.
Thanks, Hardin. That's quite some stimulus for thought. We're going to open it up to 5 minutes of questions, and of course, we've got coffee immediately afterwards, so you can kind of grab him and ask him one-to-one as well. But while we just make sure the mics are out there, I'll just ask the first question while you all have a little think. What's your best guess of the percentage chance of that net crash happening?
I think it's very high. I mean,
go on, put a number on it.
If starting point is 50%, right? Because that's don't know, right? So I think it's 75% chance that there will be a crash worse than 2008. Yeah.
Okay.
And occurring within the next 10 years.
Right.
Sorry about that.
And that's what we're here for. Think about the future. And your mix of the gold standard, Bitcoin.
Well, there's a saying in the crypto community that the prices will go to the moon. And I with my futurist hat on, I think that's kind of interesting, because we see Elon Musk trying to go to Mars, which is a little bit further away than the moon. But if you wanted a reserve currency system that would work between planets, then you'd be better off with Bitcoin, because you could do your interplanetary settlement rather more rapidly than you might with a spaceship full of gold. So just a thought. So I'm that's slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I think the IMF may like to think that it can save the day with the SDR and possibly a gold-backed SDR, but I have my doubts. We'll see, because I think things could get quite disorderly at that point. And individual citizens are not going to be given direct access to SDRs. They'll be holding their fiat currency, and the fiat currency is going to be inflating like crazy. And you might just think about having some Bitcoins under that scenario. So I'd be kind of tending down there to, the picture's changed, tending to be quite bullish about Bitcoin.
Okay. Other questions? Anybody got something they'd like to ask at the moment? Hands up. There are microphones if anybody's there. I can just about see with the lights as they are. Oh, we've got one down here at the front. Thank you. Come in there. Wait for the microphone. Yeah. I can't see this from that.
Finance aside, what's your most shocking prediction for our society in all the industries and sectors you've been looking at? What do you think is going to make us stay awake at night?
Well, what's going on in the United States at the moment is quite interesting. I think there's a sort of civil war at the highest levels of power in the United States, and that could tip either way. So I think, because what I haven't mentioned in all this is, of course, war might be a way of resolving all this debt, because you can arrange for certain things to be blown up and so forth. I hope that's not going to be the way it goes, but it has happened before, and allegedly happened in a whole variety of cases. That is a worry, because remembering the hydrogen bomb explosion, we don't. I mean, even President Trump, for all his curious behavior, tweeted to some of his opponents, stop trying to push us into a war. It would be a nuclear war. Is that really what you want?
Any other questions? Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to ask us to thank Hardin for that. I'm sure some of you will pick it up. He's with us for the day. So I'd push him a little bit more on those things because I found it fascinating over dinner last night. But thank you very much, Hardin. Thank you. Thank you. See you there. Thanks.